God. The purpose of these lessons is our objective in life is to become partakers of the divine nature. We're told we ought to conform to the image of Jesus, and we are to possess his mind. In order for us to do that, in order for us to strive to do that, we've got to know what he's like. So the intent of these sermons is helping us see what God's like, and then we can try to become like him. So today, this is lesson 5. I want to talk about the mercy of God. See how he is merciful, at least in one example. I want to use King David as an example. He's a character that most all people are familiar with. Most of us, when we think about David, we think about him as a good guy, I suppose, because he was. But he also had another side to himself that we don't look at hardly as much, but I want to look at it. Number one, David moved the ark of God, and he did so on a cart. The ark, whenever the ark was moved, it was supposed to be carried by the priests. They would run staves or sticks through the loops on either side of the ark. They would pick it up and carry it. That's the way it's prescribed to be done in the book of Leviticus. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, David had a cart built, and then he put the ark on the cart to transport it, which of course was a violation of God's law. There was a man named Uzzah. The cart hit a chuck hole and tilted, and when it did, this fellow Uzzah, I guess he thought the ark was going to fall off the cart. He reached up his hand to steady it, and when he touched the ark, he died. He died because he touched the ark. No one was supposed to touch it. But if the ark hadn't have been on the cart, it never would have happened in the first place. So David got extremely angry with God because this man died. Ultimately, he found out that the fault actually lay with him for putting the ark on a cart in the first place. There was a bit of rebellious spirit he had about him, as you'll see it develop. Influenced by Satan in 1 Chronicles 21:1, David numbered the Israelites. Now, the reason he numbered the Israelites, he wanted to see how strong his military was. The thing was, though, he was supposed to walk by faith, not by sight. He was supposed to trust that God had everything the way it was supposed to be. By numbering his military, David was seeing whether or not he had sufficient number of soldiers to do battle, demonstrating a lack of faith in God. Because of that, he suffered the consequences of his decision. I should say others did. And 70,000 of his best soldiers died over a period of a day because of the sin of David in numbering the Israelites. The sins he committed, they might have seemed small, but as you can tell, the consequences were devastating. 70,000 people lost their lives because of his sin. David is the one who introduced polygamy into the monarchy of Israel. Man was only supposed to have one wife. He had 8. And I don't know how many concubines he had to boot. But he was only supposed to have one wife. So he wasn't paying attention to the God's law on marriage. He married for the sake of expanding his empire, and in the process he had accumulated 8 wives, which was a sin that continued in Israel throughout her existence, kings marrying multiple wives. David invented instruments of music. Before David, there weren't musical instruments in worship. But Jehovah said to David in Amos 6:4-5, "Woe to those who, like David, invent for themselves instruments of music." Now, David's been dead a long time by the time Amos spoke this. But there were other people who were doing something similar to David. That is, they were introducing new ways of doing old things. And Jehovah used David as an example of his anger because of what they were doing. Woe unto those who, like David, or as David did. Okay? The Lord is warning those who are walking in the steps of David. Those who, like David did, invent for themselves instruments of music. The purpose of doing so is very revealing. David didn't invent musical instruments for God or for the glory of God or for the sake of God. He did that for himself. That's what he liked. That's what he preferred. Rather than having a cappella singing, he preferred to sing with the accompaniment of musical instruments, the harp and such things as that. And therefore, he included those into the worship. Now, the same thing is going on in the days of Amos. And Jehovah is warning the people. Woe unto those who do as David did and invent new ways of doing old things. It's something they weren't supposed to do. So David was used an example in this case of what not to do. In chapter 5, the Lord elaborates on this much more, but suffice it to say, you can see that David had a human side to him like we do. He didn't walk on water by any stretch of the imagination. David wanted to build a house for Jehovah. In 1 Chronicles chapter 17, David said, "The word of the Lord came to me, saying, You have shed much blood, and have made great wars. You shall not build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood." More than anything else, David wanted to build this house for God. He lived in a very elaborate palace. And he got to paying attention to the fact that he lived in this palace and the Ark of God was in a tent. And to him, it didn't look right. Him living in a palace of gold and God living in a tent. And he wanted to rectify the situation. He wanted to build this house for God. And Jehovah would not let him do it. And the reason he didn't let him do it, it wasn't just because he went to war as the king of Israel. It's because he seemed to have delighted in war. He enjoyed that kind of a lifestyle. He enjoyed living the life he had lived. And because he had so much blood accredited to him, Jehovah didn't want him to be the one who built his house. He said Solomon would, that's David's boy, but David could not. So David, my point is, was not a perfect man. He was a man, just like all of us are men and women, and all of us have our faults. David did too. We often see the good side of David, and rightly so, because he had a very good side. But we ought to keep in mind that he was just a human being. The best known crime that David ever committed, I suppose, was his adulterous affair with a woman named Bathsheba. This is the one that most of us are familiar with. As the event unfolded in chapter 11, David sent Joab and his army out to do battle in the spring. Every spring, all the kings would go out and do war. Whenever it got to where the grounds weren't swamps any longer, when the water was gone, when the sun was out, when the weather was better, they would go out, they would meet in these large fields, and they would have battle, one side against the other. Every spring, spring after spring after spring, the kings engaged in this type of warfare. Well, on this occasion, David sent Joab out as the head of the army rather than going himself, as has been his custom, as kings were prone to do. Instead, he decided to stay home. Well, one evening, David walked on top of his house, and I've been where David's house was before, and you look over into a very deep ravine, and it's down the side of a mountain, and they got houses. They build houses on the side of the mountain. And he could look over the side of that mountain, over the edge of his palace there, from the roof, and he spotted a woman who was bathing. Her name was Bathsheba. Sometimes people diss her for bathing on the rooftop, but that was pretty much the custom of the times. That's where people bathed, was on top of the roof. I don't know that the woman was trying to seduce the king, as some have suggested. I think she was doing what she had probably been doing all of her life. Normally, if you were out there and you saw a woman bathing, you would turn away and not look. But David looked, and then he looked some more. She was an extremely beautiful woman, and because of her beauty, he didn't want to quit looking, so he didn't. And as he looked, he started lusting for her in his heart, because that's where adultery takes place. First is in the heart. He lusted for the woman. He sent for her. She came to him, and she conceived. After enough time elapsed where she knew she had conceived, she sent word back to David at the palace. I'm with child. Well, the child has to be hers, or his rather, because her husband, Uriah, he's off in war. He's off fighting on behalf of the nation. He wasn't there. And the only person left would be David. And of course, he's not going to own it publicly. And if her husband finds out that she got pregnant while he was off to battle, there was a death penalty against her. She would be stoned to death for being unfaithful during her husband's absence, unless, of course, the king came forward and said the child was his, which he would not do, because he wanted to keep this thing a secret. So he devised a plan. He sent for Uriah, who was out doing war. He had Uriah come home. He'd been off doing battle for I don't know how long, but long enough that you expect when the man come home, the first thing he do is bust in the house where his wife was. But Uriah didn't do that. When he got back to Jerusalem, instead of going into his own house, he stayed outside the king's palace with his other servants. And the reason he said he stayed there was because it wasn't fitting for him to go into his house and have comfort while Joab and the ark and Israel was out fighting a war that he should have been helping them fight. He felt guilty because he wasn't with them. And because he wasn't with them, he wouldn't go home, he wouldn't know his wife, he would have no comfort at all. And boy, David, he just, you big dummy. So David come up with a second idea. The second idea was that evening he got Uriah drunk. He had him to come to his palace. They got to drinking. He had Uriah drink. And when the king tells you to drink, you drink. So he drank every time the king drank. And before long, Uriah was drunk. Well, you know what a drunk man's going to do. He's going to go home to his wife. He hasn't been with his wife in a long time. He's drunk. His emotions are running high. But not Uriah. He was much too noble for that. He had a pact with his fellow soldiers. And because they were out there fighting in battle, he could not partake of any comforts while they were out there fighting. So once again, the second night, he stayed with the servants outside the palace of the king. They were guarding the king, of course. Well, David didn't know what to do. He was at his wit's end. The only thing he could think of was Uriah had to go. If Uriah died, then his wife Bathsheba would be free to marry. The king could take her and marry her as his own. So he had Uriah go back to the lines where the men were fighting. He carried a letter with him, and the letter told Joab, who was the commander of the army, he said, I want you to send Uriah into the hottest part of the battle. What he did was send him up against a wall, and that's a place you never go. When you're fighting a fortified city, you don't go up against a wall because they can pour hot oil on you. They can do all kinds of stuff when you're that close to the wall. But David told Joab to send Uriah up to the wall. Joab didn't know what was going on. He had no idea why the king wanted this man to die, but David made it clear that Uriah had to die in battle. So, as he was commanded to do, Joab sent Uriah and a company of men up against the wall. And just as everybody knew it happened, they were killed in battle. Joab sent word back to David, Uriah is dead. David married Bathsheba, and then she had a child, and the child belongs to the king. So all is well. No one's the wiser. Only a handful of people knows what happened, and they're not going to say anything because they have an allegiance with the king. So David wanted to keep this matter quiet. He did what he thought he had to do to keep it quiet, and he was successful. But there was one person who knew what David did, and he wasn't going to be quiet about it, and that, of course, was the Lord. The Lord had one of his prophets go to David because David was in big trouble. He'd sinned against God, and he was going to lose his soul the way things were at that time. And God is merciful. He's not willing that any should suffer, but that all should come to repentance, including David. So he sent Nathan to David. And Nathan went to David, and he told a parable in 2 Samuel chapter 12. And the parable went something like this. There was, in a certain area, there were two men. One was very rich, one was very poor. The rich man had a lot of herds. The poor man had one little ewe lamb. This had come to be his possession sometime when it was very small. I don't know how, but he became the owner of this ewe lamb. And he and his family loved the ewe lamb. Like we would a puppy. They took this little lamb into their house. They let the lamb sleep in the house with them. The kids played with it. The lamb ate with them. And it became a part of his family, much like dogs do in our families today. There are some people today who are so attached to their dogs that if something were to happen to that dog, it would be like some people losing a child. It would be absolutely devastating. Well, that's the way this man was by his ewe lamb, because it had become his daughter. Well, one day there was a traveler that came into the area, and he wanted to visit the rich man. And the rich man was obliged to feed him a good meal. But he was a tightwad. He didn't want to take anything out of his own herd, and because he had the power, he took this little ewe lamb away from that man and his family. Well, it wasn't little anymore, it was big. He took that lamb, had it slaughtered, had it fixed, and prepared it for the rich man to eat. And this was told to David. And David is sitting there listening. He's the judge. Nathan's come to him with this problem one man has done to another, looking for the king to advise him as to what to do. And David, he was angry, and he blurted out, "As Jehovah lives, the man that has done this is worthy to die." And in the king's eyes, he was, I suppose. Well, Nathan told him, he said, "You're the man. You're the man of the parable." Of course, it wasn't a ewe lamb you took. It was the wife of Uriah. You had all these wives. He's got one wife. You've got all this power. He has no power. You took his power. You took his life. You did everything you did because you're the rich man of the parable, and he was the poor man. And then it dawned on David what he had done. I've always been fascinated by the fact that it just dawned on him what he had done. He was responsible not just for adultery, not just for conceiving a child in adultery, not just for the lives of the men that he's responsible who were killed, but it just came to him when Nathan told him this parable. Well, David was worthy of death. Adultery was a capital crime in Israel, according to the law, and as well as murder was. Of course, murder goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. God said, "There be blood for blood. He who sheds blood by man, his blood shall be shed." In other words, it was a life for a life. David had taken the life of several men, and he should die for the crimes that he had committed. And Nathan asked him again, "Why have you despised the word of Jehovah to do what is evil in his sight?" And that's the big question. Why? Why have you despised God and committed the atrocities that you've committed? And I suppose as Nathan looked at David, anticipating an answer. Nothing happened. David said nothing. What could he say? What would he say? Why did you do this, David? What reason would he offer? What reason would you offer to God if you had committed such crimes? Why did you despise God to the point that you would do the things that you have done? Have you ever asked God to forgive you of a sin, and then before long you committed the same sin again? Have you ever done that? I've done that before. I've committed a sin. I asked God to forgive me of the sin, and I promise I won't do that again. And it probably won't be all that much time that goes by, and I commit the sin again. And if David was to come to me and say, John, why have you despised the word of the Lord to commit that sin again after God has forgiven you? Being as honest as I could possibly be, I don't know why I do that. I don't know why. I was ashamed when I did it the first time. I was ashamed when I did it the second time. I was ashamed when I did it the third time. And each time I did it, when I would go back to God, I was more ashamed than I was before to ask God to forgive me for the same thing again. I asked for forgiveness. I told him I wouldn't do it again, and I did it again. Now here I am back asking God to forgive me of the same sin again. And I'm so ashamed that I can't even look at him. Have you ever been in a situation like that? That, I think, is where David was. Why have you despised the word of the Lord? His answer, I don't know. And I think it's the truth. The Apostle Paul, he wrote about himself in Romans chapter 7. I can't go through it, take too much time. But he was experiencing things like we experience. He was committing sins, and he said, why do I do it? I don't know why. I don't understand why I do it, and I don't know why I do it. I just know that I do it. I want to do what's right, but I turn around and do what's wrong. I don't get it. I don't think David got it either. When Nathan asked him that question, I think he probably stood there and looked totally ignorant, just like I would. Because what are you going to say when you got nothing to say? Well, Nathan went ahead and told him, well, Jehovah has put away your sin. You shall not die. David was worthy of death. He said so himself. By his own admission, he was worthy of death. And then by the law, he was worthy of death. The Lord had every right to take the life of David right then. But he chose not to. Instead of taking his life, he said, David, you'll live. David found mercy. The question is, why? Why did he find mercy? I can't answer that question either. Why did God forgive him? Was it fair? I wonder what Uriah's mom and daddy thought when they found out the king murdered their son and wasn't punished for it. I wonder what his siblings might have thought when they found out what had happened, and yet the king escaped punishment. I wonder what the people of Israel thought when they discovered what their king had done. He had murdered one of his own servants, trying to cover up a sin he committed with that servant, while that servant was out fighting a war for Israel, and the king was at home. I don't know. The why part had to come to everybody's mind. David found mercy. But why? There was no good reason for him to get mercy. That's the problem when we're talking about the mercy of God. We can't understand it. We can't explain it. God is merciful to us. We don't deserve it. We've certainly earned death, but nevertheless, he is merciful. Why? Why does he choose to be merciful? In Acts chapter 13 and verse 22, we find these words, and I think it may help us to understand the answer. The Lord gave testimony back a long time ago, but Luke's recording it in the book of Acts. The Lord gave testimony and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will. The Lord looked into the heart of David. He's seen what David did, but he also peered into his heart. He said, I found David. He's a man who's after my own heart. He's a man who will do all my will. Now, obviously, all doesn't mean all. All is a word that means most of the time in our text, because David didn't always do the will of God. He committed adultery, and he was guilty of the murder of Uriah and several other men. So there were times when he didn't do the will of God. But most of the time, his heart was set on doing all of God's will. Sometimes he got selfish. Sometimes, for reasons probably unknown to David, he committed atrocities. But it didn't change anything. He still loved God, and he still pursued the will of God. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, there was a replacement being sought for Saul. In 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7, Jehovah told Samuel, as he was looking for Saul, King Saul's replacement, he said, the Lord does not see as man sees. Samuel was sent to the house of a fellow named Jesse. He was the father of David. And Jesse had 7 brothers. They were all older than he was. When the first son of Jesse came walking through for Samuel to look at, he must have been a big man and he must have been a pretty man, because these are the kinds of people they like to have for their kings. When Samuel saw this first boy, Eliab was his name, come through, he thought to himself, man, that's the next king right there. That's the one. And Jehovah told him, no, that's not him. The second one came through, and Samuel had a knee-jerk reaction again. Jehovah said, that's not him. And then he told Samuel, he said, now wait a minute, son. He said, I don't look at these fellows like you do. I don't look at a man like you do. Okay? He said, man looks at the outward appearance. And that's what Samuel was doing. Big man, strong man, pretty man. The man looks at the outward appearance. David saw man's actions, or rather Samuel, or I'm talking about the parable now. David saw man's actions and he passed judgment on him. What did he do? The rich man took the poor man's lamb. What did David say should happen? He should be put to death. Why? Because the rich man took the poor man's lamb. Based on his actions, David said the man ought to be put to death. Jehovah said that's the way men look at men. A man looks at the outward appearance. They look at the actions of a man. And that's what David said. The man that has done this is worthy to die. Based on his actions, he drew a conclusion. Well, sometimes we do that about people because they're good. Aunt so-and-so is going to go to heaven. Why? She's so good. She's done so much for others. Surely she is with the Lord. She's a good person. Based on a person's actions, we conclude this person is going to be with God. Why? Because they're such a good person. Well, they weren't a Christian, but they were such a good person. They did so much good in their life, and we draw a conclusion that they're going to be saved. We save these kinds of people, but Jehovah doesn't. We look purely at man's actions without any consideration or regard for their attitude towards the God. A lot of people, church people, they live their lives doing good. They are good. They do good. But in truth, they never really served God. They never really served the kingdom of God. They went to church. They did churchy stuff. But as far as serving God, being a servant to God, that never really happened with these folks. They never really gave themselves over to God. We look at a person's actions, we conclude that they're good enough to go because they were a Christian. They went to church. They sung songs. They gave money. They were good people. And they're going to go to heaven. That's how we make judgments, whether good, whether bad. That's how we judge people without any regard for what's going on in the heart of the individual. And that's what Jehovah acknowledged. He, on the other hand, he sees man's actions just like David did. But Jehovah doesn't rush to judgment based on actions alone. He saw what David did. He knew what David did. And yes, David was worthy of death according to his actions. But God looked beyond his actions. He looks at the heart of the individual. The Lord seeing David's actions, he looked into the heart of David, and what did he see? He seen a man that was after my own heart. A man who would do all my will. Perfect? No. Sometimes he sins. Sometimes he numbers his army. Sometimes he invents things to add to worship. Sometimes this man even takes the lives of others. Is he perfect? No. But he is a man who's truly after my own heart. For some reason, unbeknown to him, he commits these sins. He wants to do my will, but sometimes he doesn't do my will. And he doesn't even know why. He just knows that he doesn't. And when God looks into the heart and he sees who the person is on the inside, that's why he was merciful to David's sins. It wasn't just what David did. It was who David was. And David was the kind of man that God likes. David was the kind of man that God wants to live with. He was a man who was truly out to do the will of God. And like us, sometimes he missed the mark. But he always come back like us. Jehovah, Nathan said, has put away your sin, David. In other words, David was sinless. God had forgiven him the sin that he committed. We're talking about the mercy of God. I don't really know how to explain it because I don't really understand it. But I can see the mercy of God in action in the lives of others recorded in the Bible. And those instances are recorded for you and I so that we can know something about God. We're not perfect. As a matter of fact, most of us would probably admit we're far from perfect. But the real question is, do I want to be perfect? Do I want to walk with God? Do I want to please God? Do I want to make God happy? Do I love God? Or do I go through the motions, you know? What's going on inside of me? What am I made up of? A heart like David? A heart that's appealing to God or one that's not? We can have all of our frailties that we do, and heaven can still be our home because God is full of mercy. And when we sin and ask for forgiveness with an honest heart, he always forgives us. Even the third, the fourth. He told Peter one time, 7 times, 70 times, which means an infinite number of times. As long as we can find regret for the sins we do, God will always have the mercy to forgive us when we do repent. Is heaven a possibility? Heaven's a reality. Heaven is our reality. We've started on our walk towards heaven. All we've got to do now is finish it. All that remains is to cross the finish line. And then life gets really good. Do you need the mercy of God today? If you do, why don't you come and we'll pray with you to Him.